back to a new episode of Grainy Webcam Footage, where we're going to talk about Nancy Drew today. This is a week one for children's literature. Some of this material we covered prior to spring break, but I wanted to make sure that it was all in one place so that people can access it uh, easily. But let's get started. Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series was created by publisher Edward Stratemeyer, who also created the successful Hardy Boys series. And because of the Hardy's popularity, Stratemeyer wished to publish a similar series for girls. As Betsy Caprio describes her, quote, "The first Nancy Drew is a daring and very elegant 16-year-old of Depression days, although neither depression nor other current events are more than hinted at in her stories, as it was house policy to avoid references which might date its books." Though The Secret of the Old Clock and subsequent Nancy Drew stories and series were credited to a writer named Carolyn Keene, there is actually no such person. Keene is a pseudonym used by the many authors of Stratemeyer's staff who have ghostwritten the Nancy Drew stories. For those of you who don't know, ghost writers are writers who are paid to write books based on outlines or notes by a publisher or another author, and then receive no official credit for the book. That credit instead officially goes to someone else. This is common in celebrity and political memoirs and autobiographies, but you'll find it in news articles, fiction, all kinds of things like that. It happens frequently with mass-produced works. But with Nancy Drew, the true creator, as many scholars would see it, would be the first ghost writer for Nancy, who is the award-winning Iowa and Ohio journalist Mildred Augustine Wirt, who contributed to 23 of the first 30 Nancy Drew mysteries. Wirt ghosted for Stratemeyer under several pseudonyms, including Keene, but she had a number of juvenile novels published under her own name. Wirt's Nancy, as Caprio explains, is a vivacious and capable girl who's a champion of the underdog. Now, while exact writers are unknown due to the contractual obligations of the Stratemeyer Syndicate contracts, there has been enough hints and details to give us some indication of Wirt's contributions, but again, they're not legally known. The names of the authors have not been publicly advertised or acknowledged, but you can find some of that information online. Even the Library of Congress actually complied with the stipulations of these contracts when Walter Carrig, who claimed authorships of volumes 8 through 10, tried to claim the rights with the Library of Congress in 1933, but they're still listed as written by Keene in the Library of Congress. Edward Stratemeyer likely chose the name Nancy Drew as a feminine counterpart to the earlier evocative surnames given to the heroes of his male series. The Rover Boys, Tom Swift, the Hardy Boys, Don Sturdy, which is my favorite. Betsy Caprio explains a little bit of a extrapolation of what the name Drew evokes to a reader sort of subconsciously. She says, think of it. Drew, the past tense of draw, connotes competition and power, for we draw a bow or draw an opponent, maybe even draw and quarter him, or we draw a salary. And Drew is also about attraction and pulling something toward oneself, as in times when we drew fire or water, or an audience, or a breath. We even speak of how honey draws flies. And similarly, drawing a wagon or drawing blood is also about pulling something. Drawing money or drawing interest pulls something out of a bank. A chimney draws or pulls a fire upward. We pull or draw information out of someone. All of these expressions speak to a younger reader of power. But we can also say he drew the curtains and she drew up her will. And now the word indicates closing off, as it has at those times we drew near a goal or a conclusion and could see the end of the task. Yet we can also draw away, recoiling in horror perhaps, or simply withdraw to recoup. So the word drew can also have a note of grace, also, for it can be about sketching a picture. And to go beyond what Caprio is saying here, that was traditionally seen as sort of feminine vocations. They would actually call them drawing room skills that women would be encouraged to elaborate on rather than going to school or getting a job. The first 5 novels in the Nancy Drew mystery stories were all published in 1930. You have The Secret of the Old Clock, which we read for this class, The Hidden Staircase, The Bungalow Mystery, The Mystery at Lilac Inn, and The Secret of Shadow Ranch. The process of writing the Nancy Drew novels consisted of a detailed plot outline, followed by a manuscript, followed by editing. Stratemeyer and his daughters wrote most of the outlines for the original Nancy Drew series and then passed them out to other writers for the manuscripts themselves. There are 64 entries in the original Nancy Drew mystery series, with more coming later after the series switched publishers. The final entry in the Nancy Drew mystery story series, which is notable for its yellow hardcover and numbered spine that you'll see quite frequently at bookstores. That series officially ended with number 175, Werewolf in a Winter Wonderland, which was published in 2003. But for scholars and fans, we often look at the first 26 volumes as what's called Classic Nancy, and we'll get to why in a moment. There are other series that came later based on Nancy's adventures, including the Nancy Drew Files, the Nancy Drew Notebooks, Nancy Drew and the Clue Crew, Nancy Drew on Campus, River Heights, which had a little bit more of a CW approach. It's very similar to, say, like something like Riverdale. Nancy Drew, Girl Detective, Nancy Drew Diaries. There's a series of graphic novels and specials, comics that still go on to this day, and some assorted crossovers with Hardy Boys. In fact, the most recent one that's being published came under a lot of fire recently because it is a Nancy Drew Hardy Boys crossover comic book, but the plot focuses on the Hardy Boys solving the mystery of Nancy Drew's murder. Early issues sort of indicate that Nancy Drew may not actually be dead, but that came under quite a lot of scrutiny for that choice. But the character has evolved greatly since her creation, leading to revisions of the older texts beginning in 1959, ironically, the same year that the Barbie doll was born. The revisions were used mostly to remove outmoded racial stereotypes and to make Nancy seem less aggressive. Nancy's age was increased from 16 to 18, and housekeeper Hannah Gruen was created to replace the racist caricature housekeeper Beulah. Many books were shortened from 25 chapters to 20. Nancy was also changed to make her more respectful of male authority figures and to make her less tomboyish. These changes in Nancy's personality, Caprio explains, is due to the regression in the status of women during the decades after World War II. Caprio goes on to say that this watered-down Nancy was the creation of the Stratemeyer Syndicate's Harriet Adams, who is Edward's daughter and heir. Adams had been involved in editing Nancy's adventures since the 1930s and eventually claimed authorship of the entire series. She made no secret of her belief that the early Nancy was too bold and bossy, too positive, and set about to make her more gentle, send her off to church regularly, and generally dispel Nancy's larger-than-life mystique. Carson Drew, who early in Nancy's career provided his daughter with a revolver, now became a protective dad who forbids her to go sleuthing alone, and most of the time Nancy obeys him. This is generally considered where the distinction between classic Nancy and the rest of the Nancy Drew mystery stories sort of picks up under Harriet Adams' tutelage. And so those classic Nancy novels were then revised and rewritten under Adams. The version of The Secret of the Old Clock that we read for class is actually the revised version that was republished in 1959. If you want to read excerpts from the original 1930 edition of The Secret of the Old Clock, Applewood Books actually published a series of facsimile editions of those classic novels pre-revision, and I've provided you on Canvas some excerpts from The Secret of the Old Clock, if that would so interest you. But it was after Adams's death. That was when Nancy was sold to Simon and Schuster. That's when we saw other series start to take over. They sort of did a reboot in the 80s. For instance, in 1986, we got the Nancy Drew Files. I've showed you here on Canvas a couple of images of covers from the Nancy Drew Files. According to Betsy Caprio, siphoned off the romance strain that the Girl Sleuth had acquired over the decade and packaged it for the preteen paperback romance market. And you can sort of see some of that Harlequin influence on the cover design, the soft color palettes and watercolor illustrations, and very period appropriate clothing. The difference is stark. She is no longer River Heights' most famous amateur detective. She's a career woman, private eye, very much taking off on the 1980s working girl kind of archetype. But on the covers, you no longer see her adjacent to a clue or some hidden danger, but instead next to a boy. And it was never our hapless Ned Nickerson who was her love interest in the original series. In the next video, we're going to dive into a little bit more about the business of series books and how that affected childhood culture, as well as social expectations when it comes to the literacy movements in the early 1920s.